Call of Duty 4 changed everything. I don't think that's really up for debate anymore. It established a format that is still being copied almost 10 years after its release, and is the reason why my mother has apparently been fucked by every teenage boy in the United States. In my mind at least, it seemed to make gaming even more of a mainstay in popular culture than it already was. A lot of people would make the argument that the genre has just become increasingly stale and flaccid since then, that ironically perhaps COD 4's concrete formula set the stage for the fall of innovation within the genre. Publishers simply pushing devs to copy from the COD 4 blueprint. I disagree. Because of the rather simplistic nature of the first-person shooter to begin with, we'd have reached this point regardless. I'm digressing here, but it's relevant and we'll come back to this later. The release of Titanfall was weird, to say the least. Critics and reviewers everywhere seemed to give it damn near perfect scores, but the general public didn't seem to take to it with anywhere near the same amount of enthusiasm. Not by any means to say that any of us thought it was a particularly bad game as such, just more, well, not enough game to begin with. Titanfall was the first, to my knowledge at least, of the big AAA games to be released at normal regular retail price with no single player campaign at all, with very few, if any, additional modes to make up for it. It's a practice I'm not necessarily against, but think needs a lot more work to make it a viable and fair one. Skipping over this as it's a video in and of itself, I actually think Titanfall is the best first person shooter I've ever played. Now that's not as controversial as it may initially sound. It's subjective of course, so all you Quake and Counter-Strike veterans can put down your pitchforks, but aside from that, I have a few points to back it up. Evidence, you might say. Let's face it, gamers are incredibly cynical. We only ever really remember the bad. So let's put that to one side for a moment and focus on what Respawn got so right in this game. Specifically, the movement and environment design. In Titanfall, to discuss one is to discuss the other. I like the traditional 3-lane structure of the grounded Call of Duties quite a lot. It's fast, it's enjoyable, and it allows you to learn the layout of a map fairly easily. But nothing, not even the shameless rip-offs, have been able to match the sheer quality of design to be found here in Titanfall. Because of the parkour movement system, verticality is naturally something that Respawn had to nail first time, and by fucking Christ they nailed that shit to the wall. In a twitch shooter, you naturally need to give the player ample space to manoeuvre into or away from potential threats. Respawn realised that you can't just make the arenas bigger, especially as these maps will be inhabited by both Pilot and Titan at the same time. You need to map the areas out to give both an equal chance of success in a one-on-one encounter. The solution is as elegant as it is simple. Maps are essentially divided up into several central big lanes for Titans and many winding, high-rise buildings in between for pilots to skirmish and run between. And the running is so important. Maintaining momentum in your run is not only ball-clenchingly satisfyingly fluid, it's also essential to survival. Titans will often kill you with 1 or 2 shots in most cases, but they're extremely slow and their environments are limited in comparison to that of the pilots. There is very little more exhilarating yet utterly terrifying as taking on a Titan one-on-one as a pilot. Jumping from building to building, using every inch of the environment to aid your escape or inevitable victory. It's never unfair and you're given every opportunity to escape. More to its merit, succeed if you master the movement system. Pilot on pilot is no less exciting either. Spotting your target is only the start, chasing them down and finishing them is an entirely different matter. It's not a question of who shoots first in Titanfall, it's a question of who runs, moves and shoots finest. A multiplayer-only shooter is held up by the pacing of its moment-to-moment gameplay. How the gunfights feel, are they dynamic enough, does the gameplay loop offer enough to begin with, is the balancing correct? Rarely have I played a shooter with so much player involvement from moment to moment. Now, I like Battlefield well enough, but my biggest gripe with it has always been the downtime that's so often experienced when you respawn. Getting back to the action, feeling unimportant and outplayed as you make your way back to the real battlefield. There's merit to that system of course, it encourages you to play well and more specifically as a team, but in Titanfall the action never ever stops. These being the guys who essentially made the modern Twitch shooter formula, they know that player involvement doesn't just stretch to finding and eliminating other players. I've had 2 to 3 minute stretches without seeing a single pilot and never felt the least bit bored. Traversing the environment is a damn art form when you get it right, and the addition of grunts allows you to contribute to the attrition point score without actually needing to fight pilots or titans. Whilst the grunts themselves are purposefully dumb, barely ever targeting you, it nevertheless makes it feel all the more like a real war zone. They're also a fantastic diversion. The way they move on occasion, tricking you into believing they're a pilot, forcing you to stop and take notice, all the while paranoid that a rival player may capitalise on your mistake. Now, you obviously can't discuss the highs of Titanfall without mentioning the Titans themselves. For a lot of people, the idea of calling down a mechanical behemoth was the clincher as to whether or not the game would succeed. For me, I don't think they're actually that imperative. I like the Titans, and getting in one certainly makes you feel reasonably empowered and safe for a while, but they're not the be-all and end-all. If anything, I feel the matches become a little imbalanced in the late game, depending entirely on the map of course. Being the first to enter your Titan can rack you up a fantastic early match score, but once everyone enters theirs in the mid to late game, it becomes a case of numbers rather than skill. It's extremely rare you'll come out on top when facing off against more than one Titan at a time, and this isn't exactly the most team-focused game, particularly in attrition. Relying on your team members for help depends entirely on whether or not they've noticed you're in trouble. The loadouts, much like those of the pilots, are a little sparse and limited, and you'll see most of the players favouring one particular set of weapons and abilities over another. As a result of all this, I tend to favour the lightest and fastest Titan, targeting pilots and grunts as they provide more of a score bonus over fighting one particular Titan for a few minutes. Using its increased dodge and faster movement speed allows me to escape any significant threat reasonably quickly and search the map for packs of grunts or pilots. Don't get me wrong, I like the Titans a lot, and I've had some really epic moments in them, but it's just such a contrast to what it's like playing as a pilot. It's almost jarring having to change your playstyle on a whim like that, and as a result I've taken to switching my Titan to follow mode to try and pick up a few extra kills along the way. Titanfall isn't a perfect game, it isn't even a perfect shooter, not by a long shot. It has a few issues I think seriously need to be addressed in the next iteration, removing that fucking smart pistol for a start. Actually, adding a few more weapons in general wouldn't go amiss to be honest, both for Titans and pilots. The team has added a lot more modes and maps since release, and they're all free if you pick the game up now, so I guess that sort of balances it out a little bit. Though, I've played it for over 100 hours now. Does that absolve the game from the sin of that initial £50 price tag for very little game? Probably yes, but I still think there should be more there from the off. There's the foundations of what should have been a campaign here too, maybe even a good one at that. But for whatever reason, it was completely abandoned for the fucking nonsense excuse for a story mode that replaced it. I wouldn't have minded if it were a little more dynamic, playing off the consequences of won or lost matches, but it's just nothingy. It commits the quintessential storytelling crime in as much as it's just boring. And that's unacceptable when you're working on a AAA title, let alone an original one with lore you could literally just invent. Obviously, I think it holds up. I think I've given a fairly reasoned argument, if not slightly drawn out and poorly written, as to why Titanfall is as good now as it was 2 years ago, despite it being heavily imitated. Advanced Warfare and Black Ops 3 attempt to mirror the fluidity of a lot of the systems used in Titanfall, but in my honest opinion, fail at doing so. It's not so much that their attempts are bad, quite the contrary in fact, but you can just tell that Respawn had built everything with, well, just about everything else in mind. Ironically, there's actually a part of me that's almost annoyed at the fact there's going to be a single player in the next entry. I don't think there's an inherent problem in the fact that there was no campaign there to begin with, it's more the pricing structure that annoyed me. Not having a campaign allowed Respawn to make the multiplayer as wholly impressive as it is. Look, I'm not going to be one of those guys who finishes with, well, it's not for everybody and it never will be, because of course it's not and of course it won't be. What game is? What I will say is that because of the regurgitative nature of the gamer, the game has been remembered for its lack of story and variety rather than its excellent and somewhat innovative mechanics. It's the quintessential twitch shooter for me. Where most grounded shooters depend more on muscle memory and reaction times to assure a decent score, Titanfall relies purely upon the skill of the player, rewarding courage and expertise with some of the most fuck yeah moments in any video game ever. I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already. There's still quite an active community as long as you're willing to play mostly attrition mode. It's not perfect, and because it's been out for quite a while now, most players have hit the skill ceiling, but if you're at all a fan of the twitch shooter, you owe it to yourself to pick this one up.